What is going on, everybody? Welcome back to Strength Coach Rants. I'm your host, Connor Lyons, and today we're going to be talking about steroid use, what they are, how they work, and specifically why kids should be staying away from them. So today we're going to be talking about steroids, specifically our anabolic androgenic steroids, or more commonly referred to as anabolic steroids or just steroids. But steroids in general are a very broad class of hormones within the body. They have a cholesterol backbone, meaning like they are all made of cholesterol. Cholesterol is considered a steroid in and of itself. And then there are just little tweaks to the cholesterol to make these hormones essentially like play various roles within the body. We have two different classifications that we'll kind of go over a little bit today of steroids. We have our corticosteroids, and then we have our sex hormone steroids. Our sex hormone steroids are the ones that we're going to be mostly focusing on today, although we will talk about some of these corticosteroids because these sex hormone androgen steroids have an effect on these corticosteroids within the body. So to get it out of the way, corticosteroids, we have what are called mineralocorticoids, and then we have glucocorticoids. And the mineralocorticoids, they basically regulate like your the amount of water and electrolytes that you have within your body. And then our glucocorticoids really regulate the use and storage of lipids, fats, and proteins. So it's more like metabolism based, and the mineralocorticoids are more like dealing with your like water balance within your body. On the sex hormone side of things, we have androgens, right? And those are your more commonly known ones like testosterone, DHT, andro, those types of hormones. We have estrogens. Within our estrogens, we have estrone, estriol, and what's the fourth one? I can't think of the name of the fourth one. Kind of out of the scope of what we're talking about today, though. And then we have prostaglandins, which deal primarily in inflammation. So like prostacyclin, PGE2, wrote an article about inflammation. I'll link it in the description. That goes over all of those. And those are mainly kind of involved in like healing of injuries, healing of like training and playing your sport. They deal in inflammation. So that's what those do. All right, so now that that's all out of the way, we're going to get into the androgenic anabolic steroids here. And the androgenic part of it is our like sex hormone characteristic type things that are, this is the part of the steroid that makes us more aggressive, more masculine features, increases libido or can decrease libido, as we'll go over later. And then we have the anabolic side. The anabolic, again, I'll link into the description that article about inflammation because we talked about what anabolic means. It's basically just promoting metabolic activity towards building, right? So we have within our metabolism, right, we have two different parts. We have what's called our catabolism and our anabolism. So catabolism is the process of breaking things down, and anabolism is the process of building things. So, you hear somebody doesn't want to go catabolic. It means that they don't want to be in the process of breaking things down, right? That's like breaking down muscle tissue and things like that for other various needs within the body. And they want to be anabolic because they want to be in the process of consistently building, right? We want to retain that protein so that we can like recover and build bigger muscles. We don't want to be releasing that protein in an effort to create energy via gluconeogenesis, and we don't want to be releasing them to, make different immunoglobulins, right, for our immune system, because those are all amino acid based. Other things in the body utilize proteins and amino acids, like creatine is a grouping of amino acids. So amino acids aren't just used in your body to grow muscle, they're used for other things. So if we go into a catabolic state, your body is breaking that down and pulling it out in an effort to, kind of deal with these other aspects that your body has to do. You want to be in an anabolic state. All right, so hopefully now you have an understanding of definitions. You know what androgenic means. You know what anabolic means. You know that there's a difference between like the steroids that people use to get bigger and just steroid hormone classification in general. It's not all the same, but when we talk about steroids, typically, you hear somebody's like, oh, he was on steroids. He wasn't on some glucocorticosteroid. He was on an anabolic androgenic steroid. And so that's what we are going to be talking about today. So when it comes to steroids, there's basically two different groupings of steroids, right? You have your 17 alpha alkyl derivatives, and then you have your 17 beta ester derivatives. And what the difference between these two are is one is like orally available and one is like an injectable. A lot of times all of these actually are available transdermally. But we're going to break them down just into these two for now because they function very differently. One is done orally, one is done intramuscularly through the muscle via an injection. So the 17 that is in the beginning of both of those refers to the 17th carbon, all right, on this cholesterol. And what happens when they're orally available is they alkylate that 17th carbon in an effort to make it toxic to the liver. So if you were to take like testosterone in a pill and you were to swallow it, chances are like you're going to break it down, your liver's going to destroy it, and you'll never see the benefits of any of it. So what they found is that they can make it toxic to the liver, it can bypass the liver, and it can get into the bloodstream. So those orally available ones are the 17 alpha alkyl derivatives, right? So they are alkylated on that 17th carbon. And then the ones that are injectable, they have various esters on that 17th carbon instead of an alkylation. And it doesn't have to bypass the liver because it doesn't go through our stomach. It goes into the muscle, and then it can go right into the bloodstream and be used the way that you're intending for it to be used. So those are the biggest differences there. Now, the orally available steroids tend to be a little faster acting. Their half-lives are a lot shorter, right? They get into the bloodstream like a lot quicker. You're talking about half-lives of like 6 to 8 hours, as opposed to the injectable versions, which sometimes are days long, right? You have to take a lot more of the pills because, right, the half-life's a lot shorter. You've got to keep your testosterone levels up like to a certain place because you do not want like the ebbs and flows of highs and lows. You want to have fairly consistent levels like while you're on the steroid, or else you're going to put yourself in like a really bad emotional place and you're not going to get what you want out of it. So these orally available ones, they tend to be toxic to the liver. They act a little bit faster. Their half-lives are a lot shorter. You have to take more frequently to get the benefits of it. And they're usually more dangerous, right? We talked about how the 17th carbon having that alkylation on it, that's going to make it toxic to the liver. It can actually like increase liver enzymes, and you can, in a roundabout way, over time, give yourself liver cancer, cause your liver to fail. If you're somebody who drinks and uses oral steroids, like you probably shouldn't because you're putting a lot more stress on your liver. When you're taking these oral steroids, you probably also shouldn't take Tylenol. You shouldn't take Tylenol for a lot of reasons, but you really shouldn't because it's toxic to the liver as well. And you don't want to be putting your liver through all of this if you don't have to. The injectable steroids, they tend to be, and then to go back, the oral ones, they're going to be taken in smaller dosages, right? We're talking about like 2 to 10 milligrams at most at a time. Because the half-life is so short, you can take it more free, or you have to take it more frequently. We're not taking nearly as much. You don't want to take like 100 milligram pill of like methyl 1 testosterone because you're going to have a really bad time. So then we have the injectable ones, right? So instead of that alkylation on that 17th carbon, they have like an ester, right? So you have things like testosterone cypionate, propionate, enanthate. Those are all esters that sit on that 17th carbon, and that's what allows like your body to kind of break it down and over time and do what it needs to do with it. The injectable ones tend to be a little bit safer, and I say that because, again, it's not toxic to the liver. You're not going to see the increase in liver enzymes. You're not going to potentially give yourself liver cancer or put yourself at risk of like having your liver fail on you. They have longer half-lives, right? Those esters are a little bit heavier and they take longer to break down. So something like even like testosterone, where we have probably the most common ones are enanthate, propionate, and cypionate. Those are the ones I said earlier. They all have different weights to them, so their half-lives are all a little bit different. Where if you've got somebody who's on like a propionate, that's a very small, like light ester, it's going to break down a little bit faster, so that's going to be something that you have to inject more often, where something like an enanthate is going to be a little bit heavier, so that breaks down over time, and you're not going to have to inject quite as often. It also can be... the heaviness of it can like weigh on the pain of the injection. A lot of people don't like to use a testosterone propionate because they say it feels like you're shooting glass in your muscle. because it is just it's a lot more intense when you put it in. You don't want to have to do it every day or every other day. Most people will say, all right, well, I'll just do test and anthate because I can do that every 3 to 4 days. You have within these, and actually let me back up just a little bit back to these orally available ones. Just a list, if you've ever heard of these are all oral. You have like a Winstrol, tends to be oral unless it's a depot. You've got dianabol, halotestin, turinabol, methyl 1-testosterone. Those are all very common, methyl test, premobolan, Anavar, it's another one. Then Anadrol, like things like that. Those are the orally available ones. All right. Then within the injectable, right, we have Trenbolone. We're actually going to spend a good amount of time on that one later because that is it's one of the worst when it comes to side effects and things like that. You have Winstrol and a depot, right? So we talked about Winstrol, how it can be orally available. Well, it can also be injectable. Decadurabolin. Then we have Durabolin, which are nandrolone derivatives. One is a phenylpropionate. One is just a decanoate. We have the various test esters, right? So propionate, cypionate, and anthate. There's some others, but those tend to be the most popular. Equipoise. And Primo is also like an injectable as well. So within these two classifications, you have other classifications. Some of these are more androgenic. Some of them tend to be more anabolic. And we're going to talk about the kind of differences between some of those later on in this episode. But right now, just understand that there's a difference between like orally available and injectable steroids, and they have different impacts, different half-lives, different dosages, whereas we talked earlier about the pills being like a lot less. You're only taking like 2 to 10 milligrams at a time. More than that, that's just what the pill size is. With the injectables, usually you're like 250 plus when you go to inject. Probably close to like 150 to 250, somewhere in that space, depending on how much you hate yourself and how much you want to put in your body. The dosages are a lot higher because you're not doing them every 2 to 3, 4 hours. You're doing them every other day, every day, every third day, every fourth day, depending on what you're on, because the half-lives, again, are all very different because they all have different weights on that ester. I want to talk about nandrolone for a minute here. Nandrolone is a very popular one. Deca, right? That's what nandrolone is. Deca is a nandrolone derivative. Just two things here. The half-life on this is a very, very long half-life. It's got a positive test window of upwards of like 18 months. So if you ever hear an athlete testing positive for it, you hear nandrolone, that athlete is a moron, and whoever's running their drug schedule is also a moron, because there is almost zero chance that you will not get caught using a nandrolone. All right. And then also, if you hear an athlete gets caught using nandrolone and they say like it was inadvertent use, like, oh, it must have been a tainted supplement, there's absolutely no way that that's the case, because it is an injectable. It would not be able to bypass the liver if we took it orally, so it's really hard to pop positive for nandrolone via what they call inadvertent use. So next after this, right, so we've got the two different kinds, classifications. Within those classifications, everything's a little bit more anabolic or androgenic, different half-lives, different weights, different real purposes. And now we're going to go into some of the negative health side effects from utilizing steroids, and then we'll get more into some of the various steroids that we're going to talk about today. All right, so a lot of people take steroids for the positive benefits, but what are the downsides? What are the bad side effects, and can they be mitigated? So for starters, steroid use is typically going to lower your HDL and increase your LDL, which is the good and bad cholesterol. So you're increasing the quote-unquote bad cholesterol and decreasing the good cholesterol. You'll have an overall increase in cholesterol, which is going to have an impact on your blood pressure as well. The injectable steroids tend to not be as harsh on the heart because they don't stimulate the hepatic lipase, again, because it doesn't have to bypass the liver, and that decreases high density, like the HDLs, right, or high density lipoproteins. Dry cough, there's something called the trend cough, right, that some guys get and gals get when they use injectables. So this isn't going to be something that you deal with if if you're using oral steroids, but the tren cough can make you feel like you're dying in the moment. What happens is when you go to inject, and this doesn't just come from tren, but it happens to come from tren a lot, I think, because tren's such a popular steroid. Maybe just more people are taking it, so they coined it tren cough. So these and we didn't go over this before, we probably should. The injectable steroids are mostly like oil based, so they're sitting in an oil. That's how they keep from going bad. You can't just put it in like a bacteriostatic water. There has to be an oil suspension for it to maintain its integrity over time. So you inject that into your body, and if you hit like a capillary bed or a venule or a vein or an artery, something like that, that oil goes into that artery or vein or venule or whatever, arterial, all the various types of blood vessels, and it goes back to the lungs, and it's like a foreign object inside your lungs. It feels like somebody's pouring water down your throat into your lungs. You feel like you're drowning. You can't stop coughing. You'll probably get like the sweats, and it feels like you're dying, but you're not. It's just something got into your lungs that shouldn't have been in there because it went into a place where you weren't intending it to go when you injected it. So you have to be careful. If you're going to use steroids, you need to aspirate. Make sure that you're not pulling out any blood. If you are when you aspirate, then more than likely you're in a place you don't want to be. You want to move around, find it, a spot in the muscle to make sure that you don't end up with this tren cough. It's not going to kill you, but it's very unpleasant. Decreased libido and increased libido. So if, depending on what you're on, the androgenic side effects, if they're high enough, can increase your libido. If they get too high, they can actually start to decrease your libido, which is very much an unwanted side effect. There's actually a term coined called DECA-DIC, and that's where guys are on these nandrolone derivatives or DECA, and it doesn't work. They get ED, and that can happen with other steroids as well. It's just very common, not popular, very common when it comes to nandrolone. So the reason why is because nandrolone decreases DHT, and DHT is like primary, like sex characteristic hormone. When DHT gets increased, that's when guys go bald, they get hairy, they get acne, things like that. But nandrolone decreases DHT. Now, the reason for that is it essentially blocks like the 5-alpha reductase enzyme, right, and doesn't let it break down to DHT. So whereas normally like your testosterone goes through this process where it gets broken down into DHT, that doesn't happen. So you don't have those levels of DHT to keep your libido up, so you can end up with ED, which is not a very fun thing, so ED, not good. DECA-DIC, don't want it. Increase estrogen. Now, this is actually like a good and a bad thing when it comes to body comp. If you're trying to be as big as you can, and we're going to go over this later, like in a lot more detail, like elevated estrogen is not the worst thing in the world, but estrogen has some unwanted side effects. So if you are on something that's a lot more androgenic than it is anabolic, you can end up with things like water retention, gynecomastia, or more commonly known as bitch tits, and fat depositing, right? Because estrogen has an impact on the glucocorticoids that we were talking about earlier. And again, we're going to go over that in a lot more detail later. But it can make you retain water, it can make you fatter, and it can give you man boobs. So all bad things. Increased aggression or roid rage. Now, what I will say is with every guy I've known that's been on some kind of steroid, I have not seen this. In my experience, what steroids will do is they will amplify what you are. If you're kind of a jerk, you're probably going to be an asshole. If you're confident, you're probably going to get cocky. If you're cocky, you're probably going to turn into a little bit narcissistic. It's just going to amplify whatever you are as a human being. I don't know if anybody's ever watched the old what was it? Like after school specials about drug use. There was one with Ben Affleck taking steroids. This was like in the 90s. Horribly done, and it is fantastic. Go watch it because of just how poorly done it was. But it shows this guy essentially beating the crap out of his girlfriend and breaking his entire room, just destroying it, all because he was on too many steroids. And I haven't noticed a lot of guys acting that way. That's not really all that common. I think that they give you a little bit of a like euphoric confidence, and that sometimes for some people can make them act in ways that they normally wouldn't. But I wouldn't say roid rage is like a very common thing that happens to people, or at least I haven't noticed it with the probably hundreds of guys that I've been around that have been on them throughout my entire career. So those are some of the negative side effects. Next, we're going to go into how steroids actually work. All right, so in post, I was editing this, and I figured why not just go ahead and throw in that Ben Affleck after school special, because it's hilarious and it shows the absolute absurdity of like trying to scare people into not taking steroids. And while kids should stay away from them, this is kind of funny, so we're going to watch it now.
Bryce, I got to get bigger, man. This might help. Steroids.
What is going on with you?
God damn it!
All right, so that is not very typical of most of the steroid users I have come across in my life, but I thought it was funny that they chose to use Ben Affleck as a football player in high school needing to get bigger, who ends up beating the crap out of his girlfriend and destroying his house. That's not typically the way it plays out, but there it is. I just thought I'd throw that in here real quick. All right, so the way steroids work within the body, there are some direct and some indirect consequences of steroid or androgen use, right? Some of these effects are the androgen actually doing something, and then some of these effects are the androgen acting with or on like another substrate within the body. So the first thing that steroids do, one of the ways they work from an anabolic perspective, is there is some evidence to suggest that they basically turn on, like there's direct activation of androgen receptors within the cell. So the thought process is if we have more androgens, then we turn on more of these receptors and we increase the rate at which protein synthesis occurs. Or I guess not the rate, but the time, because we're not always in an anabolic state. Your body's in a constant kind of battle of anabolism and catabolism with cortisol telling the cell when it's damaged to release proteins, and androgen saying, no, hold on to them, we want to build. So there's some thoughts that the more like androgen receptors get turned on and are activated, the more likely this anabolic process, or anabolism is going to happen. So from an anabolic state, it keeps us in a state of anabolism, right? That's going to tell us to create and build protein structures within the cell. There's also some anti-catabolic effects to steroid use, supposedly. So what we think happens is, and because we don't really know these things, we make some educated guesses based on some studies and what we understand various hormones do within the body. But there's some evidence to suggest that these androgens have an anti-catabolic effect by overriding what cortisol is doing, right? That our body's in a constant state of trying to build and trying to break, with, corticosteroids telling your body that after when there's some inflammation after any kind of injury or training effect, to ship all the protein out, we got to release these things. And then the androgens saying, no, let's hold on to them, we got to build. And we think that these increased concentrations of androgens and more androgen receptor sites turning on and being activated, that it kind of overrides that corticosteroid or cortisol signal to break down. So we think not only is it anabolic, but it can be anti-catabolic in the sense that it kind of shuts down what cortisol is trying to do. Testosterone has also been shown to have like good effects on creatine by increasing our overall creatine concentrations within the cell. So if you don't know much about creatine, the way it works is it's not like a steroid at all, although there are tons of wives' tales. And I'll link in the description. I wrote an article about creatine and what it is, how to use it. Like, I think it was called Creatine, What Is It and Why Aren't You Using It? But essentially what it does is within our body, whenever there are muscle actions, we need energy. We have something called ATP, or adenosine triphosphate. Now, what gives us energy is the breaking of this molecule from adenosine triphosphate to adenosine diphosphate and 1-phosphate molecule. So that breaking of that bond is what creates that energy. Now, here's where creatine comes in. Creatine comes in, grabs that phosphate molecule, and reattaches it to that what is now ADP to make ATP, right? So all those processes are happening. You've got a lot of ATP breaking, trying to create as much energy as possible. Creatine's coming in, trying to, recreate that ATP as fast and as much as it can. But if you don't have lots of creatine or high creatine stores, you're not going to be able to kind of create that reaction as often, if that makes sense. So think of it, if you have, you're trying to build a building and you have X amount of bricks and X amount of cement, I guess. And then you've got like 5 workers. It doesn't matter how much of the cement and the bricks that you have, the workers can only get so much accomplished. But if you can double, triple, or quadruple the amount of workers you have now, you can build that building 4, 5, 6 times as fast because, they can get the job done. They can take those substrates and make something out of them. That's kind of what creatine does. So testosterone and increases in androgens have been shown to enhance this process and increase our overall creatine stores and concentrations within the body. Androgens have also been shown to have high responsiveness with insulin-like growth factor, increases in IGF-1 receptors, or I guess this receptor sensitivity. That's been shown to happen too. And again, that's well outside of the scope of what we're talking about today. But insulin-like growth factor is a big part of our overall growth and recovery. It deals a lot in satellite cell activation and our recovery process. We're not going to get into that, but making those receptor sites like more sensitive is a very good thing when it comes to both recovery and growth. Trying to think. That was the last one I had written down. All right, so now testosterone and estrogen. So when we have higher levels of testosterone in the body, I'm not sure if everybody's aware of this. I assume everybody is, but let's start from the same premise here. Men make estrogen as well. One of the ways that we make estrogen, or the way that we make estrogen, is by breaking down testosterone. So men and women also have something called an aromatase enzyme. What this aromatase enzyme does is it binds to the testosterone, makes some modifications, which helps create estrogen within the body. Now, if you have a lot more testosterone, what do you think is going to happen, right? So if I've got a lot of testosterone, this aromatase enzyme is going to break down that testosterone. I'm more than likely going to increase the concentrations of estrogen within my body as well. So we need to talk about what estrogen does within the body when it comes to growth and all that too, because chances are, unless you're on like an androlone derivative or something that's not like super, like something that doesn't aromatize very easily, and that's what it's called when we make estrogen out of testosterone, it's called aromatization, then we're going to have higher levels of estrogen. There are, and we should mention here, some substances that athletes or people in the general public on steroids will take called an aromatase inhibitor. There's a brand name Arimidex. There's a couple other ones. And what that does is that goes in and it binds to those aromatase enzymes and doesn't allow that estrogen to be created from that testosterone because it blocks that enzyme from doing its job. That's very common with a lot of people who are on test or higher aromatizing steroids. But if you're trying to get as big as humanly possible, or you want like the most body comp, right, and you're not overly worried about being completely shredded, like you might not want to block all of that estrogen, maybe some of it, but we don't want to have such high concentrations of testosterone and other androgens while not also having a little bit of an elevated estrogen, because estrogen has some very good properties, and we're going to go over that now. All right, so we talked earlier about some of the negative health effects, or not even really health effects, but unwanted side effects of increased estrogen from some of these, anabolic androgenic steroids. Now we're going to talk about some of the benefits. So believe it or not, estrogen's pretty, what's the word I'm looking for, anabolic. So what it can do is it increases what's called G6PD, or glucose 6-phosphate dehydrogenase, right? And that's actually very important in the pentose pathway, which is a way that we kind of create, it's like a glycolytic pathway. We create more sugars like pentose, and it helps increase amino acid biosynthesis. And God, what was the other thing? It reduces oxidative stress, right? So that amino acid biosynthesis, God, there's a lot of big words today, like protein synthesis, right? So estrogen can actually help increase protein synthesis, which is pretty wild. They found this out in a study. This was like years ago. They injected these guys with was it testosterone propionate, which is an ester of testosterone that we talked about earlier, and they found that within this test that they were seeing the signs of this increased G6PD, or glucose 6 phosphate dehydrogenase. And it wasn't from the testosterone itself. It was actually from the aromatization of this testosterone into estrogen. So those higher estrogen levels yielded more of this G6PD, and it meant that they were going to go through protein synthesis a little bit easier. So believe it or not, estrogen, anabolic. Boom, who knew? Aromatase inhibitors that we talked about earlier, like Arimidex, you might want to use a less potent one or minimize the use of it if you really are trying to get as big as you can. Another aspect of estrogen is that it increases alertness. There's something that happens in steroid users sometimes called steroid fatigue. It's like a lethargy. You're very lethargic, steroid lethargy. And it's because the T to E ratio gets pretty wild here if you're on enough gear and if you're using an aromatase inhibitor, specifically a pretty potent one. So that testosterone to estrogen ratio can get pretty out of whack. And estrogen's involved in serotonin, right? So higher levels of estrogen actually yield more serotonin, and serotonin's one of the neurotransmitters that's kind of that's what I'm looking for. It correlates with alertness, right? So, and I've seen this very recently. We just had a kid, and Desiree will wake up every time the baby makes a noise. If she rolls over, she's awake, right? She's very alert when it comes to the baby. I don't have that. She has very high estrogen levels, right? Due to the whole pregnancy, your body does some pretty crazy and wild, amazing things, and that's one of them. Is her estrogen levels are much more high right now, and that's probably leading to a lot more alertness when it comes to our daughter. Mother Nature's pretty amazing when it comes to that. And then there's also, as far as estrogen goes, you're going to see an increase in the concentration of androgen receptors with increased estrogen, which is pretty wild. So what that means is if we have slightly more estrogen, we're going to have more androgen receptors that can use this free testosterone that we now have floating throughout our body so it can do its job even more effectively. So if we take these super potent aromatase inhibitors and we don't aromatize any of this test into estrogen, you're actually missing out on a lot of very good benefits. You're not going to be nearly as fatigued. You'll be more anabolic, and you'll have more sensitive and a higher concentration of androgen receptors, which will help the excess testosterone that you have kind of floating around your body do its job even better. Now, one thing I will say, if you are on an orally, in an oral steroid that's very androgenic, like a Dianabol or a methyl 1 test or a methylated test or trying to think what other ones. Those are probably the biggest ones that are going to aromatize very readily. It is going to aromatize into a version like a C17 alkylated estrogen as well. So if you are on an orally available steroid, you probably do need to take some kind of the aromatase inhibitor, only because that estrogen that is toxic to the liver now is going to stay in your body a little bit longer. So we don't want no estrogen, but we don't want crazy high levels of it either, because it is. We don't want all of those side effects like gynecomastia, which is not going to go away when you go off. Water retention is not a bad thing, right? Mass moves mass. That protein synthesis is good, but we don't necessarily want all the things that come with it. So if you are taking something that is a little bit more readily aromatizable, I don't think that's a word, then maybe a light aromatase inhibitor is in order. But we do want some of those benefits from estrogen, so don't think no estrogen at all. It is fairly anabolic, so we want to make sure that we've got some level of it in our body. All right, so earlier I alluded to the fact that we were going to talk about, why kids should not be taking steroids, and we're going to do this specifically talking about tren, because tren, for some reason, is the holy grail. It is the devil's steroid. It is what everybody wants to take because the benefits are so high. However, the cost is very, very high. I'm not sure that the cost to benefit ratio kind of works in favor of you taking this drug. So tren is a nandrolone derivative, right? So it's like a deca or like a nandrolone phenylpropionate or a nandrolone deconate. So it's not just testosterone. It's slightly different. It doesn't aromatize very easily, right? So we don't get the benefits that we would get from some of that estrogen. It does not go through the 5-alpha reductase to convert to DHT, so it can really throw like a lot of things out of whack. You can end up with ED. You can end up being pretty depressed. There's a lot of things that aren't the best when it comes to this drug. So I'm going to go over this. I wrote down a list of like what tren is really known for. And these aren't great things. And these are for when it comes to kids, like, and we'll talk specifically just a couple minutes from now, for a couple minutes about why kids really shouldn't dabble in these things. But this is just like an amplified list. Most steroids are going to have some of these side effects, but this one for some reason seems to be the absolute worst. I will say from like personal experience, knowing a lot of guys who have used it, I don't know a single guy who's been on tren who didn't think or talk about self-deletion, right? It is very, very dangerous when it comes to your emotional health if you aren't, if you are emotionally stable, but if you're not an emotionally stable person, which I feel like more and more people aren't anymore, this is not a drug you want to mess with. All right. So tren is known for night sweats. All right. That tren cough and night sweats. I'm talking about like needing to change and wash your sheets every night. Like that's how bad it is. Vivid nightmares, like very, very vivid nightmares. I know guys who like they had to go off of it specifically because the nightmares were so bad and they were so vivid. Depression, like I said, self-deletion. We're talking suicide here. Like very, very intense thoughts of it. Wild anxiety about just general things. So walking around an anxious, depressed mess, thinking about killing yourself, not a great thing, right? It's going to obviously lower estrogen because it is that nandrolone derivative that doesn't aromatize very easily. It can work very quickly. So if you're on a steroid, right, it may be 4, 6, 8 weeks before you really notice any difference. With something like tren, if you're an athlete and you're already in fairly good shape, like 10 days, 2 weeks, you probably notice some pretty significant changes in your body. And that's both from a strength and a look perspective, right? Because it doesn't aromatize very easily, we're not going to get the added water retention, right? So there's actually, believe it or not, some evidence to suggest that it actually helps with burning fat because of the effects that it has on corticosteroids within the body, specifically cortisol, more so than any other drug. And it promotes the utilization of glucose as opposed to the storing of it. So it can make you very shredded as well. I know that's not a bad thing, but that's one of the reasons guys want to take it. Whew. The recovery coming off something like tren can be very hard and very long. Like I said, the amount of guys that I know who have taken it, who have thought about suicide, who are depressed, who are anxious, yet when they're in the gym are monsters and super happy and super excited because of like how much stronger they get, how much bigger they get, how much better they look, right? But is that trade-off worth it? We talk about everyone's always like tren. It is probably the worst steroid to ever think about using, especially if you've never used them before. If there are kids listening to this, which, like I said, I don't think we get many kids, but if you're thinking about, using steroids first, just don't. We'll talk about that in a few minutes. Why? But secondly, like tren is not something to play with. It is like it's like skipping, like if you were gonna try drugs, it's like skipping marijuana and going straight to bath salts. Right? That would be what using tren is if you've never taken a steroid before. So no, it is not for beginners. It is not for kids. Just stay away from it in general. I had one more thing written down that I really wanted to talk about. It's just hard to bounce back from. I wrote it again because I wanted to make a point to talk about it again. It is very hard to bounce back from. So if you're not emotionally really well adjusted, if you are a kid, or if you're just an absolute anxiety ball and depression ball, tren is not for you. Just stay away from it. Don't use it. And now we're going to kind of go over why kids should not be taking steroids. All right, so to close this off this week, we're going to talk about why kids should not be taking steroids. And there's a lot of reasons why, but we're going to start off with like the low-hanging fruit here. Like, you don't deserve them yet. You haven't been training nearly long enough, right? So you're still doing the newbie gains. like you're still putting on mass pretty easily. Like there's no point in taking steroids. Like get what you can out of your body, right? Is like take your own gains as far as you can before you even think about using steroids. You're not sleeping, you're not eating right anyways. Get those things in check. If you get your eating and your sleeping in check, you're going to be surprised how much weight you're going to be able to put on, how much stronger you're going to be able to get. Your testosterone levels right now are higher than they will ever be for the rest of your life. There's no point in, so there's this negative feedback within our body. So if you do take steroids, right? If you take exogenous chemicals or hormones and put them in your body's going to recognize that there's an overabundance of this androgen, and it's going to say, all right, well, we don't need to waste energy making more, so let's just let what's out there do its job. You're going to shut off your own very high testosterone production for probably less, right? So you may not see anything out of them outside of like the negative side effects. So you're not sleeping right, you're not eating right, you don't need them. Steroids are your ace card, right? They are the card that you flip when you have nothing left. If you have to flip that card to play high school football or high school hockey or high school baseball, chances are you're not going to play in college. If you have to flip that card to play these things in college, right, you're probably not going to play at the professional level, right? And if you have to flip it to play at the professional level, chances are you're going to extend your career a little bit. Dave Tate gave a speech about that one time, and I remember listening to it, and it really hit home for me. Like, once you do that, you can't undo it, right? Once you've trained on gear, you cannot like undo that experience, and you're going to be left chasing that ghost for the rest of your life. So you don't need it. Get your eating, your sleeping, your training. That's another thing. You're probably not training in the best possible way, right? If you're trying to get stronger, there's a specific way to do that. If you're trying to get bigger, there's a specific way to do that. There are lots of ways to manipulate these variables in the gym that don't involve you taking steroids that will help you get bigger, faster, stronger without even needing them. So there's a lot of reasons why you shouldn't take them. Those are the performance side. On the other side, right? Think of yourself. You're 15, 16, 17-year-old boy. You're already emotionally a wreck, right? You're going through puberty. There's a lot of weird things happening. You don't need to throw in something that's going to really mess with that process even more. That's why specifically tren, like kids should not take tren. Kids shouldn't take steroids in general, but kids extra shouldn't take tren. We don't want the bath salts of steroids to be your first ever time doing a steroid, right? It could leave you in a really bad place. There's a lot of... there's a few kids who have died after coming off of steroids, right? There was in Texas, I can't remember the kid's name. He was a pitcher, and he was on steroids. His parents found out. They took him to a doc, and the doc told him to get off of them. And when he went off of them, that's when shit really hit the fan. That's when things got really bad for him emotionally, and he ended up committing suicide. So you're not smart enough to understand how to get off of them. You're not smart enough to really understand, like, you can't just go off of them. There's a process to coming off of them. Chances are you're not going to have access to the things that you need coming off of them, in addition to not knowing what to take to come off of them. You don't need them. Get your eating, your sleeping, your training in order before you even think about it. Don't take the bath salts of steroids like as your first cycle or any cycle. God, that's really it. You don't need to be in an emotional mess. Your testosterone levels, again, I'll reiterate this, are higher than they're ever going to be for the rest of your life. Take advantage of it. Eat right, sleep right, train right, and you will not need steroids or even need to think about them, because they'll probably put you behind the eight ball, and you won't get all the gains that you're hoping for. You're just going to end up a depressed, sad mess with a nice set of tits and probably more fat than. All right, well, that's it for this week. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully now you know something about how steroids work, what they are, the differences between the many of them, understanding that like prostaglandins, androgens, estrogens, corticosteroids, glucocorticosteroids, mineral steroids, that they're all very different. And they function differently, and they're not all the same. Hopefully if you are young or you have someone who's young that is listening to this, they understand that like they need to get a lot of things in check before they even think about using steroids, and just the negative kind of down pitfalls of steroid use, especially in young kids. Take advantage of your testosterone levels now. Train right, eat right, sleep right. Next week, we're going to be going over some of these research chemicals that also kids are taking to try to get a competitive advantage on the field of play and how bad they can be. So tune into that, and we'll see you next time.